I stared at my phone, watching the notification banner slide down from the top of my screen. Quantrex Dynamics stock had just plummeted another 12% in a single day. That made it a 32% drop since I'd walked out of their Denver headquarters exactly 1 week ago. I couldn't help but smile as I took a sip of my coffee, gazing out at the mountain view from my new condo. Some might call it petty satisfaction, but I preferred to think of it as karmic justice. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 36 years old, and until last week, I was the chief engineer of automation processes at Quantrex Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing automated logistics companies in the country. If you've ordered anything online in the past 2 years that arrived with surprising speed and efficiency, there's a good chance my AI systems helped get it to your doorstep. I was the silent brain behind the company's entire automation infrastructure. The AI optimization system I designed saved them $92 million in operational costs over the last 18 months. Not that you'd ever hear my name mentioned in their press releases or investor calls. No, that honor was reserved for people with MBAs and corner offices who could translate what I built into investor-friendly PowerPoint slides. I set my phone down and walked to the window. Denver sprawled before me, the early morning sun casting long shadows from the skyscrapers downtown. Among them stood the glass tower where Quantrex occupied the top 10 floors. I wondered how many emergency meetings were happening in those conference rooms right now, with executives trying to figure out why their miracle automation system was gradually falling apart. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 years, I'd warned them about building a more resilient system, about not cutting corners on key infrastructure pieces, about recognizing the human element in what we were building. They always nodded, then proceeded to do exactly what they'd planned anyway. Until 3 weeks ago, when I was called into an unexpected meeting with our new CFO, Grant Keller. I remember walking into that sterile conference room, the one with the inspirational quotes stenciled on the wall. Grant was sitting there with HR Director Melissa Chen. Their expressions reminded me of funeral directors, professionally somber but ultimately detached. "Claire, thanks for coming in on short notice," Grant had said, gesturing to the chair across from him. He wore the standard issue executive uniform, blue button-down, no tie, designer watch probably worth more than my monthly salary. His Wharton MBA diploma had been prominently displayed in his office since the day he arrived 6 months ago, though I'd never actually had a direct conversation with him until that moment. "We wanted to discuss some organizational adjustments we're making," Melissa began, sliding a folder across the table. I didn't open it. I already had a suspicion about what was coming. 2 weeks earlier, I'd noticed my access to certain administrative systems had been quietly downgraded. Small changes, but telling ones. As you know, we're entering a new fiscal quarter, and we're making some strategic realignments to our bonus structure and departmental leadership. Grant continued. He had that particular tone executives use when they're delivering bad news they've convinced themselves is actually rational and necessary. Given the current market conditions and investor expectations, we've had to make some difficult decisions about resource allocation. The conversation that followed was as predictable as it was infuriating. My proposed $250,000 performance bonus, recommended by my previous boss before he left, was being adjusted to $8,000 due to budgetary constraints. Meanwhile, Grant had just received a $400,000 bonus for strategic restructuring initiatives that were, in reality, direct results of the systems I had built. We also wanted to discuss an exciting development in the AI division, Melissa added, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. We've brought on Megan Doyle from MIT to lead our next-generation AI initiatives. We think you two will work wonderfully together. Translation: I was being sidelined. Megan was brilliant. No doubt, I'd reviewed her papers, but she was also 10 years younger, significantly less expensive, and, most importantly, hadn't built up enough political capital to demand proper recognition for her work. We'll need you to start transitioning some of your knowledge to Megan over the next few weeks. Grant continued, pushing another document toward me. Just a formality to ensure smooth operations. I glanced at the document. It was labeled Knowledge Transfer Protocol. But what it actually outlined was my gradual removal from access to the very systems I had built. They wanted me to sign away my administrative privileges and provide detailed documentation of all my work, effectively making myself redundant. What they didn't know was that I had anticipated this moment for months. When you work in corporate America long enough, you develop a sixth sense for these things. The sudden exclusion from executive meetings, the requests for just a quick document explaining your most complex work, the subtle redirecting of credit during presentations. I didn't argue, I didn't threaten, I simply nodded, took the documents, and said I'd review them. Grant and Melissa exchanged a glance that clearly communicated their relief at my apparent compliance. But compliance wasn't my plan, not by a long shot. When I first designed the Q Auto Logic system that ran Quantrex's entire logistics operation, I had built in what programmers sometimes call an exit clause, a security condition that would trigger if the system's creator was removed from access without proper legal validation. It wasn't malicious code, it didn't destroy data or crash systems. It simply caused the AI nodes to begin operating in isolation mode, gradually refusing to synchronize new data with the main system. I had coded this feature during a particularly dark period when the previous CTO had tried to claim my work as his own. I never expected to actually use it. It was insurance, the digital equivalent of having a lawyer keep sealed documents in case of emergency. That night, after the meeting, I logged into a backup node I'd established on an independent server in Utah. This node still recognized me as having ultimate oversight authority. With a few keystrokes, I activated the exit clause protocol, then deleted the logs of my access. The changes would propagate slowly through the system, not fast enough to be noticed immediately, but inevitably. The next morning, I submitted my resignation letter. 2 weeks' notice, professionally worded, citing new opportunities as my reason for leaving. I spent those 2 weeks documenting systems as requested, transferring knowledge to Megan, who, to her credit, seemed uncomfortable with the situation and behaving like the model employee. On my last day, Grant stopped by my nearly empty office. "Claire, I want you to know we really value your contributions. If you ever want to come back, we'd be happy to discuss consultant opportunities." I smiled and thanked him for the consideration. I didn't mention that his valuing my contributions hadn't extended to paying me what I was worth, or that the systems he relied on were already beginning their slow, inevitable degradation. 3 days after I walked out of Quantrex for the last time, the processing systems at 6 distribution centers began to inexplicably slow down. Nothing dramatic, just a 3% decrease in efficiency as the AI lost its ability to optimize based on real-time data. By the end of the first week, that number had grown to 7%. A large Northwestern grocery chain complained that orders were arriving 28% later than scheduled. By the second week, Quantrex stock had fallen 17% as analysts questioned the stability of the company's AI systems. The message boards were full of speculation about whether the much-touted automation platform had been oversold to investors. I received an email from Megan. "Something strange is happening with the AI update protocols. The system seems to be refusing to accept new pattern recognition data. Can you check if this is something you've seen before?" I waited 12 hours before responding with a vague suggestion about checking the validation protocols, something that would take days to fully investigate and ultimately lead nowhere. The third week brought a formal email from Grant, offering me a special consulting position at $5,000 per day to help resolve the technical challenges they were experiencing. I declined politely. "I'm sorry, but I'm currently focused on developing a better system." And I hadn't been idle during those 3 weeks. I'd reached out to 3 former colleagues who had either left or been pushed out of Quantrex. Daniel Reyes, a brilliant engineer who'd been laid off during cost optimizations. Sarah Chen, a former operations manager who'd questioned Grant's restructuring. And Lawrence Washington, a legal counsel who'd been sidelined after raising concerns about how certain customer data was being used. Together, we formed ClearPath Systems. Our mission was to build a logistics AI platform that was transparent, decentralized, and couldn't be manipulated by short-term financial priorities. We'd seen firsthand how Quantrex's single-minded focus on quarterly profits had led to cutting corners on ethical AI implementation. Within 2 months, We had secured trial contracts with 4 independent logistics companies. Our pitch was simple. We offered the same efficiency as Quantrex, but with better security, more transparency, and a guaranteed lack of mysterious system failures. Meanwhile, Quantrex continued its decline. A leaked internal document revealed that executives had deliberately pushed me out to avoid paying my bonus, not understanding that the entire system had been coded against such manipulation. Shareholders filed suit for being kept in the dark about technical risks. The CEO and Grant were suspended pending investigation. By the 6-month mark, ClearPath had been selected as the official logistics platform for a coalition of domestic U.S. carriers. I was invited to speak at an international conference on AI logistics with the theme, Transparency is the Future of Automation. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the room full of industry leaders, I couldn't help but think about that meeting with Grant and Melissa. How they had so casually dismissed years of my work, thinking they could simply extract what they needed from me and discard the rest. They cut my bonus after I saved them $92 million. I told the audience, I didn't fight, I just walked away and let the code speak for itself. Some exits aren't failures, they're triggers for something better. The applause was gratifying, but what followed was even better. As we expanded ClearPath, we made sure every engineer, every developer, every person who contributed received proper credit and compensation. We built a system that couldn't be controlled by any single entity, including me. Because ultimately, that was the lesson I'd learned at Quantrex. Systems built on exploitation eventually exploit everyone, even those who think they're in control. Today, as I look out from my office at our new headquarters, I can see the Quantrex building in the distance. They're still operating, though at a much reduced capacity. I hear they've hired a new CTO who's rebuilding their systems from scratch. Good luck to them. Some lessons have to be learned the hard way. As for me, I've discovered that the best exit clauses aren't written in code, but in how you choose to respond when undervalued. Sometimes walking away is the most powerful statement you can make. Sometimes the code really does speak for itself. The morning after my conference speech went viral, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. LinkedIn notifications, Twitter mentions, email interview requests. Apparently, taking down a $4.2 billion logistics company with a few lines of code made for good headlines. Claire Whitmore, the engineer who coded her revenge, was trending. Not exactly accurate, this wasn't revenge, it was a failsafe I'd hoped never to use, but nuance doesn't generate clicks. I silenced my phone and poured another cup of coffee. My condo still had moving boxes stacked in corners. I hadn't had time to properly settle in. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of building ClearPath, securing investors, and recruiting a team I could trust. Interior decorating hadn't been a priority. A knock at my door surprised me. It was Sarah Chen, my operations director and one of my partners in ClearPath. Have you seen the latest? She asked, walking in without waiting for an invitation. Sarah had that efficient energy that made her exceptional at logistics. No wasted movements, no unnecessary words. She handed me her tablet. On screen was a press release from Quantrex. Company announces new leadership and system overhaul. I skimmed it quickly. The board had officially removed the CEO and Grant. Their interim replacement was Dr. Thomas Zhang, a respected name in ethical AI development. I knew him by reputation. Solid engineer, strong principles. They're trying to salvage what they can, Sarah said, taking the tablet back. But the damage is done. 3 more major clients canceled their contracts this morning. I don't want to destroy them, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. That was never the goal. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Could have fooled me with that speech yesterday. I shook my head. That was, I don't know, cathartic. Maybe. But hundreds of people work at Quantrex. Most of them had nothing to do with what happened. Sarah studied me for a moment. So, what's your play here? Extend an olive branch. I considered it. ClearPath was gaining momentum, but we were still small. Absorbing Quantrex's client base too quickly could overwhelm our systems. and there was something unsettling about watching a company implode, even one that had treated me poorly. "Let me make a call," I said. 20 minutes later, I was on the phone with Dr. Zhang. Our conversation was cautious at first, two engineers sizing each other up, but gradually warmed as we discovered shared values about AI ethics and corporate responsibility. "I'll be blunt, Claire," he said eventually. "We need your help. The system is degrading faster than we can patch it." "I know. Can you fix it?" I paused. "I can. The question is whether I should." He was quiet for a moment. "What would it take?" "A complete overhaul of how Quantrex operates. Transparent attribution for engineering work. Equitable compensation structures. And a formal acknowledgement of what happened." "The board won't like that last part. Legal is worried about shareholder lawsuits." "Those are coming anyway," I pointed out. "Better to control the narrative." We negotiated for nearly an hour. By the end, we had the outline of an agreement. I would provide the key to stabilizing their systems in exchange for Quantrex publicly acknowledging their error in pushing me out. Additionally, they would implement a new compensation structure for their technical team and establish an ethics committee with actual power to impact decisions. "One more thing," I added. "Megan Doyle stays as AI director if she wants to. She's brilliant, and none of this was her fault." Zhang agreed. We set up a meeting for the following day at Quantrex headquarters. Walking back into that building was stranger than I'd anticipated. 6 months ago, I'd left with a cardboard box of personal items and a carefully concealed sense of vindication. Now I returned as something between a savior and a conqueror. The reception area was quieter than I remembered. The stock drop had clearly affected morale. The receptionist recognized me immediately, her eyes widening slightly before she regained her professional composure. "Ms. Whitmore, Dr. Zhang is expecting you in the main conference room." As I walked through the familiar hallways, I noticed people watching me. Some nodded in recognition, others quickly looked away. Word had clearly spread about why I was there. The main conference room, the one reserved for board meetings and major client presentations, was occupied by a small group when I arrived. Dr. Zhang sat at the head of the table. Beside him was Megan Doyle, looking both excited and anxious. 3 board members were present, including Diane Foster, the only board member who had consistently advocated for better engineering recognition. A corporate lawyer sat in the corner, his expression carefully neutral. "Claire." Zhang stood to greet me. "Thank you for coming. I've briefed everyone on our discussion." I nodded, taking the offered seat. "And everyone's on board." One of the board members, Robert Ellison, if I remembered correctly, cleared his throat. "We have concerns about admitting liability so publicly." "This isn't about liability," I replied. "It's about integrity. You can't build a company on AI principles of truth and pattern recognition while simultaneously misrepresenting reality to your employees, customers, and shareholders. We're prepared to offer you a substantial consulting fee to resolve the situation discreetly." He continued as if I hadn't spoken. I smiled. That's exactly the mindset that created this problem. Money isn't always the solution, especially when trust has been broken. Diane Foster leaned forward. "Claire's right. We made a strategic error in how we handled her departure. We're still paying for it. If we want to move forward, we need to acknowledge that mistake." The debate continued for another hour. I presented my terms clearly. I would provide the key to stabilizing their AI systems in exchange for public acknowledgement, structural changes to engineer compensation, and the establishment of a meaningful ethics committee. Eventually, they agreed. I suspected their capitulation had less to do with moral epiphany and more to do with the continuing stock decline. But the outcome was what mattered. I turned to Megan. "Ready to see how this works?" She nodded eagerly. Together, we walked to the main server room. The technical team watched nervously as I logged into the system using administrator credentials Zhang had provided. "The exit clause isn't malicious code," I explained as I worked. "It's more like a protective immune response. When you removed my authentication without proper protocols, The system began to isolate nodes to prevent what it interpreted as unauthorized access. That's actually brilliant, Megan said, watching my keystrokes. You essentially gave the system an ethical framework that recognized its own creation lineage. Exactly. AI shouldn't just optimize for efficiency, it needs to understand provenance, where it came from, and why. It took about 20 minutes to deactivate the exit clause. I walked Megan through each step, explaining the philosophy behind the design. When we finished, I turned to her. It's your system now, take care of it. She looked surprised. You're not staying to help rebuild. I shook my head. I have ClearPath, but I'm happy to consult if you run into problems. We returned to the conference room, where I confirmed that the system was stabilizing. Relief was visible on every face. Our agreement, I prompted. Zhang nodded to the lawyer, who passed me a document. It contained everything we'd discussed: public acknowledgement, restructured compensation, ethics committee with real power. We'll issue the press release tomorrow, Zhang said. And I've scheduled an all-hands meeting to explain the changes internally. I signed the consulting agreement they'd prepared. 1 year, limited scope, focused on transition and stabilization. The fee was substantial, but that wasn't why I'd agreed to help. As I left the building, Diane Foster walked with me to the elevator. You know, she said quietly, when you first built Q Autologic, I argued that you should have been made a partner in the company. The value you created warranted it. I know. I saw the board minutes during discovery for our ClearPath patents. She looked surprised, then smiled. Of course you did. Nothing stays hidden in systems you design. The elevator arrived. Before stepping in, I turned to her. The future of AI isn't just about better algorithms. It's about better humans making decisions about those algorithms. Is that what ClearPath is building? It's what we're trying to build. The code is the easy part. The culture is harder. As the elevator doors closed, I felt a weight lifting. Quantrex had been my creation in many ways, not just the systems I'd built, but the lessons I'd learned there. Now it would either evolve or fade away. Either way, I was moving forward. When I reached the lobby, my phone buzzed with a message from Lawrence, our legal counsel at ClearPath. Have you seen the Federal Transportation Commission announcement? They're establishing new guidelines for AI logistics systems. They want to talk to us. I smiled as I stepped into the sunlight. Sometimes, when you walk away from something broken, you end up building something that changes everything. The Federal Transportation Commission hearing room was intimidatingly formal, with its wood-paneled walls and government seals. I adjusted my microphone and tried to appear calmer than I felt. Testifying before a federal regulatory body hadn't been on my 5-year plan when I'd walked out of Quantrex. Yet here I was, 6 months after helping stabilize Quantrex's systems, advocating for national standards in AI logistics oversight. Beside me sat Lawrence Washington, ClearPath's legal counsel, and across the room, Dr. Zhang represented Quantrex in what had become an unexpected alliance. Min Whitmore, began Commissioner Eleanor Garcia. Your written testimony suggests that the logistics AI industry requires a new regulatory framework. Could you elaborate on why existing regulations are insufficient? I leaned forward. Current regulations were designed for human decision-making chains with clear accountability. But modern logistics AI makes thousands of routing decisions per second across interconnected networks. When something goes wrong, it's nearly impossible to trace responsibility under existing frameworks. And you believe your exit clause concept should be standardized? Asked Commissioner James Park, who had been skeptical throughout the hearings. Not exactly, I clarified. The exit clause was a personal failsafe in a specific situation. What we need are industry-wide transparency protocols that make AI decision paths traceable and accountable, regardless of personnel changes. The questioning continued for hours. Technical details about node isolation, ethical considerations of AI autonomy, the balance between proprietary systems and public oversight. Throughout it all, I emphasized one core principle. AI systems that impact public infrastructure must be transparent and ethically constrained. not black boxes optimized solely for profit. When the hearing adjourned, reporters clustered around us in the hallway. The story had captured public interest, partly because of the dramatic Quantrex collapse and recovery, but increasingly because people were beginning to understand how thoroughly AI systems had integrated into their daily lives. Ms. Whitmore, is it true that ClearPath and Quantrex are developing a joint standard? Called out a reporter from Tech Insights. I glanced at Dr. Zhang, who nodded slightly. We're exploring a common framework for ethical AI implementation. I confirmed. Despite our company's history, we share a commitment to responsible automation. More questions followed, but Lawrence eventually extracted us from the crowd. Outside, Dr. Zhang caught up with us. That went well, he said. Though Commissioner Park seemed determined to paint the exit clause as corporate sabotage. It wasn't my finest moment, I admitted, but it's led to something important. Zhang nodded. The joint standard is gaining traction. 3 more logistics companies joined the working group yesterday. This collaboration had been unexpected. After stabilizing Quantrex's systems, I'd assumed our companies would become competitors. Instead, the experience had created an opportunity for something more valuable, an industry-wide rethinking of how logistics AI should function. Dinner to discuss next steps, Zhang suggested. I'll have to take a rain check, I replied. I'm flying to Chicago tonight, site visit for our new operations center. ClearPath was expanding rapidly. The publicity from the Quantrex situation, combined with our emphasis on ethical AI implementation, had attracted clients concerned about similar vulnerabilities in their own systems. We'd grown from our original 4-person team to over 60 employees in less than a year. Back at our Denver headquarters, I found Daniel Reyes, our chief engineer, working late in the lab. How'd it go with the government types? He asked, not looking up from his screen. Better than expected. They're actually listening. Daniel snorted. Miracle of miracles. The joint standard with Quantrex is moving forward too. That got his attention. Daniel had been the most skeptical about working with Quantrex. His layoff had been particularly callous, security escorting him out the same day. No chance to say goodbye to his team. You really think they've changed? He asked. I sat down beside him. The leadership has, Zhang is the real deal. The question is whether the culture can follow. Culture is just what happens when no one's watching, Daniel said, turning back to his work. The true test will be their next quarterly crunch. He wasn't wrong. Corporate transformations were notoriously difficult to sustain, especially when profit pressures mounted. Quantrex's stock had stabilized but remained well below its peak. What are you working on so late? I asked, changing the subject. Daniel's expression brightened. Remember that distributed validation protocol we discussed? I think I've cracked it. The system can now verify decision integrity across nodes without centralizing authority. He showed me the code. It was elegant, a system that could ensure each AI decision in the logistics chain was validated against ethical parameters without creating bottlenecks. If it worked at scale, it would be a significant advancement. This could be the cornerstone of the joint standard, I said. Have you run the simulation? Starting it now, should have results by morning. I left him to his work and headed to my office to prepare for the Chicago trip. As I packed up my laptop, I noticed an email from Megan Doyle at Quantrex. Need your perspective on something unusual in the legacy code? Can we talk tomorrow? I frowned. We'd thoroughly documented the system stabilization process. What could she have found? I sent a quick reply, suggesting a video call from Chicago the next day. That call would prove more significant than I could have imagined. The next evening, from my hotel in Chicago, I connected with Megan. She looked tired, her usual enthusiasm dimmed. What's going on? I asked. I've been doing a deep audit of the Q Autologic architecture, she began. Not just the exit clause components, but the entire decision framework. And I found something concerning. She shared her screen, showing a code module I didn't recognize. This appears to be a secondary optimization protocol embedded in the routing decisions, but it's not documented anywhere in the system specifications. I studied the code. It wasn't mine. When was this implemented? That's the thing, about a month before you left. But access logs show it wasn't you who added it. A chill ran through me. Who then? Grant Keller's credentials. Grant, the CFO who had cut my bonus and facilitated my removal. What was he doing modifying core system code? What does it do? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect. Megan hesitated. It subtly prioritizes routing for certain clients, ones with connections to board members or major investors. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarms. But over time, it diverts resources away from regular customers. I closed my eyes briefly. This explained some anomalies I'd noticed but hadn't had time to investigate before my departure. Small inefficiencies that didn't make sense in an otherwise optimized system. Have you told Zhang? She nodded. This morning. He's furious. This undermines everything we've been saying about system integrity. And everything we're proposing in the joint standard, I added. There's more, Megan continued. I found evidence that Grant was planning to expand this functionality. Notes in a private repository suggest he was developing ways to monetize routing priorities, essentially creating a pay-to-play system within the AI's decision framework. This was worse than I'd thought. Not just preferential treatment for connected clients, but a fundamental corruption of the system's purpose. We need to disclose this, I said immediately, to the commission, to clients, everyone. Zhang agrees. He's meeting with the board tomorrow, but he wanted me to talk to you first, given your history with the system. I thought about it. This revelation could destroy the progress we'd made with the joint standard. It would certainly damage Quantrex further, but concealing it would undermine everything I'd been fighting for regarding AI transparency. Tell Zhang I support full disclosure, and tell him ClearPath will stand by Quantrex if they do the right thing here. After the call ended, I sat in my hotel room, staring out at the Chicago skyline. The discovery had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. Not because of what Grant had done, his ethics had always been questionable, but because I hadn't caught it. A significant corruption had been introduced into my system, and I'd missed it. I called Daniel immediately. We need to strengthen our validation protocols, I said without preamble. If this could happen at Quantrex, it could happen anywhere. What's going on? He asked, alarmed by my tone. I explained what Megan had found. Daniel listened silently. This changes everything about the joint standard, he finally said. We need verifiable constraints against this kind of manipulation. Exactly. How's that distributed validation protocol coming? Simulation showed promising results. But now I'm thinking we need to take it further. Immutable audit trails for every system modification, with decentralized verification. Start building it, I'll be back tomorrow, and we'll put the whole team on this. The next day was a whirlwind. Zhang called early to inform me that the Quantrex board had agreed to full disclosure. They would announce Grant's code manipulation at a press conference that afternoon and provide complete details to the Federal Transportation Commission. I rearranged my schedule in Chicago and flew back to Denver immediately. The ClearPath team gathered in our conference room to watch the Quantrex announcement live. Zhang stood at the podium, looking grave but determined. He detailed exactly what had been discovered, acknowledged the breach of trust, and outlined the steps Quantrex was taking to remove the corrupted code and prevent similar manipulations in the future. Most importantly, he concluded, this incident reinforces why the joint industry standard we're developing with ClearPath Systems and other partners is so critical. AI systems that impact public infrastructure must be transparent, ethical, and resistant to manipulation, even from within. The questions from reporters were predictably brutal. Quantrex stock would take another hit, no doubt. But as I watched Zhang handle the interrogation with honesty and technical precision, I felt a grudging respect. This was leadership I could work with. When the press conference ended, I addressed my team. This is why our work matters. I told them, what happened at Quantrex could happen anywhere AI systems are implemented without proper ethical constraints and transparency protocols. Our joint standard just became more important than ever. Over the next few weeks, We accelerated work on what would eventually be called the Transparent Logistics AI Protocol, or TLAP. The discovery of Grant's code manipulation created a sense of urgency that transcended corporate boundaries. Quantrex engineers worked alongside our team, sharing insights and building verification systems. The Federal Transportation Commission, initially skeptical, became strong advocates for the standard. Commissioner Garcia personally visited our Denver headquarters to review the technical architecture. "What you're building here isn't just about logistics," she told me during that visit. "It's a blueprint for how AI governance should work across industries." She wasn't wrong. The principles we were embedding in TLAP, transparent decision paths, distributed verification, ethical constraints that couldn't be overridden by any single authority, had applications far beyond moving packages from point A to point B. 6 months later, I stood in the ClearPath auditorium, watching as representatives from 12 major logistics companies signed the TLAP implementation agreement. Quantrex and ClearPath, once adversaries, were now co-architects of an industry standard that would reshape how AI systems were built and governed. After the ceremony, I found myself standing next to Jiang at the reception. "Did you ever imagine this outcome when you called me about your failing systems?" I asked him. He smiled slightly. "Honestly, no. I was just trying to stop the bleeding. And now I think we might actually be building something important." He paused. "I owe you an apology, Claire. Not just for what happened at Quantrex before my time, but for initially approaching this as a technical problem to be fixed rather than a fundamental issue of values." "You changed course when it mattered," I acknowledged. "That's rare in corporate leadership." As we talked, I noticed Megan Doyle approaching with someone I didn't recognize. A woman about my age with the focused intensity I associated with serious engineers. "Claire, Dr. Jiang," Megan said. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Aisha Kapoor. She's leading the AI Ethics Initiative at the National Institute of Standards and Technology." Dr. Kapoor shook my hand firmly. "Ms. Whitmore, your work on TLAP has caught the attention of several federal agencies. We're interested in exploring how these principles might apply to other critical infrastructure systems." And just like that, what had begun as a personal response to corporate injustice expanded into something with national implications. Over the next year, ClearPath would grow into a leader not just in logistics AI but in ethical AI governance across sectors. The exit clause that had brought Quantrex to its knees became a case study in AI ethics courses at universities. Sometimes I thought back to that conference room with Grant and Melissa. When they so casually dismissed years of my work, they couldn't have imagined that their short-sighted decision would ultimately lead to an industry transformation. As Dr. Kapoor outlined her vision for national AI standards, I caught Sarah's eye across the room. She raised her glass slightly in a silent toast. We'd come a long way from those first days of ClearPath, working out of her apartment with uncertainty clouding our future. The code had indeed spoken for itself. But it had said something more profound than I'd initially intended. It wasn't just about one engineer's value being recognized. It was about building systems that recognize the value of integrity itself, in both their human creators and their algorithmic decisions. And that, I realized, was a legacy worth building. 3 years after the collapse and rebirth of Quantrex, I found myself in an unexpected place sitting in the Oval Office, explaining the principles of transparent AI governance to the President of the United States. "So this system you've developed, TLAP, it ensures that AI decisions can always be traced and verified," the President asked, leaning forward in her chair. "Yes, Madam President," I replied. "But more importantly, it ensures that the ethical constraints built into the system cannot be overridden without distributed consensus and transparent documentation." Dr. Kapoor, now heading the Federal AI Oversight Commission, nodded in agreement. What began in logistics has proven applicable across critical infrastructure. The energy grid implementations have been particularly successful. This meeting was the culmination of a journey I could never have predicted. ClearPath had evolved from a logistics AI company into a pioneer in ethical AI governance across sectors. The systems we'd built were now managing everything from medication distribution networks to power grid optimizations. The president studied the briefing materials. And Quantrex is fully on board with this standardization. They're one of our strongest advocates. I confirmed. Dr. Zhang leads their implementation team. What I didn't mention was how profoundly Quantrex had transformed internally. After the disclosure of Grant's code manipulation, they had undergone a complete leadership overhaul. Their new board included 2 prominent AI ethics researchers and a former regulatory official. Most surprisingly, they had recently appointed Megan Doyle as CEO, the youngest in the company's history and the first with a purely technical background. The meeting concluded with the president endorsing a national framework based on TLAP principles for all AI systems connected to critical infrastructure. As we left the White House, Dr. Kapoor turned to me. When I first read about your exit clause incident, I thought it was just another tech company drama. She admitted, I never imagined it would lead to this. Neither did I said truthfully. I was just trying to protect my work. You protected much more than that. Back at our Washington office, I found Daniel and Sarah waiting anxiously for news of the meeting. She's on board, I told them, full endorsement of the national framework. Sarah's usual reserve broke into a rare smile. That's going to accelerate adoption across sectors. Daniel, ever the pragmatic engineer, was already thinking ahead. We'll need to scale our implementation teams. The demand is going to be enormous. He wasn't wrong. The president's endorsement would make TLAP principles the de facto standard for AI governance across the country. Our team of 60 had already grown to over 300. We would likely need to double that in the coming year. Later that evening, I sat alone in my hotel room, reflecting on the extraordinary path that had led to this moment. My phone buzzed with a message, an invitation from Megan Doyle to speak at Quantrex's annual innovation conference. The subject line read, Time to tell our story together. I smiled at the irony. The company that had once tried to erase my contributions now wanted to feature me as a keynote speaker. But there was something fitting about it too. The narrative had evolved beyond personal vindication into something more meaningful. I replied with a simple, yes. 3 weeks later, I stood on stage at the Quantrex Innovation Center. The audience was filled with engineers, executives from across the logistics industry, and a surprising number of university students. Megan had introduced a new fellowship program that brought engineering students into real-world AI development. 3 years ago, I walked out of Quantrex with a cardboard box and activated what became known as the exit clause. I began, noting the uncomfortable shifts among some of the audience members who remembered that tumultuous time. I'm not here to rehash old grievances. I'm here because what happened next matters more than what happened then. I detailed how the crisis had forced a reckoning not just within Quantrex, but across the industry. How the joint standard had emerged from the ruins of confrontation. How systems designed to be transparent and ethically constrained were proving more resilient and ultimately more profitable than their opaque counterparts. The exit clause was a protection mechanism born from distrust. I concluded. But what we've built since then is something far more powerful. Systems designed with trust as their foundation. Megan joined me on stage for the Q&A session. Though we'd worked together on TLAP implementation, this was our first public appearance as allies rather than representatives of competing companies. Looking back, asked one audience member, do you regret activating the exit clause? I considered the question carefully. I regret that it was necessary. I regret the disruption it caused for many innocent employees and customers. But I don't regret the outcome. An industry-wide commitment to building AI systems that can't be manipulated for short-term gain at the expense of integrity. Megan nodded. That manipulation would have continued and expanded if Claire hadn't forced a reckoning. Sometimes systems need to break before they can be rebuilt properly. After the conference, Megan invited me to tour the rebuilt Quantrex headquarters. The physical space had been transformed, more collaborative areas, engineering teams centrally located rather than hidden away from the executive suites, and notably, a wall of recognition highlighting key contributions from team members across the company. This is quite a change, I observed. Everything's different now, she replied. Not just the space, but how we operate. Engineering decisions can't be overridden by financial expediency. Bonuses are tied to system integrity as much as to profit margins. As we walked, I noticed familiar faces, engineers who had been junior when I left, now leading teams. They nodded in recognition, some stopping to shake my hand or share quick updates on projects they were working on. In the main development lab, I was surprised to see Sarah Chen from ClearPath deep in conversation with a Quantrex team. "What's she doing here?" I asked Megan. "Didn't she tell you we're exploring a formal merger of our TLAP implementation teams? With the national framework coming, it makes sense to consolidate expertise." A merger. Sarah hadn't mentioned this. It made strategic sense, certainly. But the idea of ClearPath and Quantrex becoming one entity was still startling given our history. "Don't worry," Megan added, noting my expression. "The proposal maintains ClearPath's independence on governance principles. This would be a technical implementation partnership, not a corporate takeover." Sarah spotted us and came over. "I was going to tell you tonight," she said, answering my unspoken question. "The opportunity just came up yesterday." "It's a good idea," I acknowledged, "but it would need careful structure to maintain the ethical priorities we've established." "Already working on it," Sarah assured me. "Lawrence is drafting the framework." As we continued the tour, I found myself in a strange emotional space. Part pride in how far things had come, part disorientation at finding myself welcomed in a place I'd once fled. The Quantrex of today was fundamentally different from the company that had tried to push me aside. The final stop was Megan's office, the CEO's corner suite that had once belonged to the executive who had signed off on cutting my bonus. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Where his office had been all dark wood and imposing furniture, hers was open and functional, with transparent glass walls and engineering diagrams covering whiteboards. "I want to show you something," she said, pulling up a presentation on her screen. "This is our 5-year vision." The plan she outlined was ambitious, expanding TLAP principles beyond logistics into healthcare AI, financial systems, even educational algorithms. Quantrex was positioning itself not just as a logistics company, but as a leader in ethical AI implementation across sectors. "This looks familiar," I noted. "ClearPath has been moving in similar directions." "I know," Megan said. "That's why the merger makes sense. Together, we have the technical expertise and moral authority to lead this transformation." She was right. ClearPath had the ethical framework and governance expertise. Quantrex had scale and implementation experience. Together, we could accelerate the adoption of transparent AI principles far faster than either company could alone. "What would you call this combined entity?" I asked. "That's something we should decide together," she replied. "But I've been thinking about Clearway, honoring both our origins while suggesting a path forward." It was elegant, and it acknowledged that both companies had contributed to the new direction. That evening, I met with Daniel, Sarah, and Lawrence to discuss the merger proposal. Daniel was initially skeptical. "After everything they did, we're just going to join forces," he questioned. "It's not the same company," Sarah pointed out. "Different leadership, different values, different goals, and different compensation structures," Lawrence added pragmatically. The merged entity would adopt ClearPath's profit-sharing model for engineering contributions. We debated late into the night, weighing principles against pragmatism, past injuries against future possibilities. By morning, we had the outline of a counter-proposal, one that preserved our core ethical requirements while embracing the strategic advantages of the merger. 6 months later, Clearway Technologies launched with a clear mission: building AI systems worthy of human trust. The logo combined elements from both companies, but the governing principles were unmistakably those we had established at ClearPath. I took on the role of Chief Ethics Officer, while Megan continued as CEO. Daniel became Chief Technology Officer of the combined entity, and Sarah led global operations. Even Dr. Zhang found a place as Head of Research and Development. Our first major project under the new structure was implementing the national framework for AI governance across critical infrastructure. The work was challenging but deeply meaningful, establishing standards that would shape how AI systems interacted with human society for decades to come. 1 year after the merger, I stood on the balcony of our new headquarters, watching teams of engineers who had once been competitors working side by side. The exit clause that had started this journey was now a case study taught in business schools and engineering programs, not as a cautionary tale of revenge, but as a turning point in how AI systems were designed and governed. My phone buzzed with a notification. The Federal AI Oversight Commission had just announced the formal adoption of what they were calling Whitmore Standards for Transparent AI Governance. TLAP principles expanded and codified into regulatory requirements for any AI system with public impact. As I read the announcement, I thought about that meeting with Grant and Melissa years ago. How they had so casually dismissed the value of the systems I had built. How their short-sighted focus on quarterly profits had blinded them to the importance of integrity in both human and artificial systems. They couldn't have imagined that their decision would ultimately lead to national standards bearing my name. That their attempt to sideline one engineer would catalyze an industry-wide transformation in how AI systems were built and governed. I put my phone away and rejoined the engineering team working on our latest project, an AI healthcare distribution system designed to ensure equitable access to medical resources across geographic and socioeconomic boundaries. The work was complex and vital, combining technical challenges with profound ethical considerations. As I listened to the team debate implementation approaches, I was struck by how thoroughly the culture had changed. Engineers confidently advocated for ethical constraints alongside efficiency improvements. Financial considerations were present but not paramount. Attribution for ideas was scrupulously maintained. This was the real victory, not the professional recognition or the regulatory adoption, but the fundamental shift in how these systems were conceived and constructed. The exit clause had been necessary, but it was just the beginning. What came after was the real achievement. Later that day, I received an email from a professor at MIT requesting permission to interview me for a book on AI ethics and corporate responsibility. The subject line read, "When Code Speaks, the Whitmore Standard and the Future of Ethical AI." I smiled at the reference. The code speaks for itself had become something of a catchphrase in AI governance circles, shorthand for the principle that systems should be transparent enough that their ethical constraints were evident in their very structure. As I typed my reply, accepting the interview request, I reflected on how far we had come from that moment when I had walked away from Quantrex, trusting that the code I had written would indeed speak for itself. It had spoken. And what had begun as one engineer's protection mechanism had evolved into something that would shape the future of AI development across industries and nations. Sometimes walking away is the most powerful statement you can make, but what you build afterward, that's what truly changes the world. They cut my bonus after I saved them $92 million. I didn't fight. I just walked away and let the code speak for itself. And in the end, it spoke volumes about the future we could build together.